So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Bill Charlton. I'm a professor at Texas A&M University. I teach nuclear safeguards and nuclear security to students there, primarily graduate students, but also undergraduate students. And my background is, prior to going into academia, I worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the Nonproliferation and National Security Division there, and then went and taught at the University of Texas for about 3 years, and then after that went on to teach at Texas A&M University. Those of you who know American football know that the University of Texas and Texas A&M University are rivals, and so we don't usually talk too much about my time at the University of Texas. This particular session is focused on nuclear safety and terrorism. We're going to discuss primarily the impacts of security-related questions and how those relate to nuclear safety and vice versa. I have with me 3 additional panelists. We will start by going through, and I'll introduce each of those panelists, and then each of us will have an opportunity to give about 5 to 7 minutes worth of remarks. And then following that, I will try my best to moderate a discussion amongst the panelists and then open it up to questions from the audience. So let me first introduce each of the panelists. To my immediate left is Mr. Jonathan Erbach. He's currently the member of the Nuclear Security Working Group of the International Nuclear Law Association. He's a researcher in the PRIV War project, and he conducted extensive research into the law pertaining to biological weapons, including ways to prevent the acquisition and malicious use of biological agents by terrorist groups. And he currently works at the Center for Conflict and Security Law at Utrecht University. I don't know if I pronounced that properly.
Yeah, perfect.
That's hard to believe, but thank you. To his left is Dr. Hwang Il-sun, whom I've had the pleasure of meeting on several occasions. He is a professor at the School of Energy Systems Engineering at Seoul National University. Previously, he led Korean implementation of the IEA's periodic safety review. He was director of Nuclear Transmutation Energy Research Center of Korea, and he chairs or co-chairs the IEA Advanced Partitioning Expert Group, the OECD NEA Task Force on Lead Alloy Coolant Technology, and the Forum on Climate Change and Nuclear Energy, or Energy Policy, and the Nuclear Power Infrastructure Development Seminar, and the Summit of Honor on Atoms for Peace and the Environment, or SHAPE. And last but certainly not least is Mr. Neo Yasuke, who is the Deputy Director of the Integrated Support Center for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Nuclear Security, the Japan Atomic Energy Agency. He previously served 20 years as a chemist and safety analyst in the heavy water reactor development. He's the technical advisor for, was technical advisor for KEDO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, which, if you remember, was mentioned earlier today, and researched on mechanisms of assurance of fuel supply for the Cabinet Assistance for the Office of the Government of Japan. And so, as I said, I will start with some of my own remarks, and then following that, I will allow the other speakers to talk. I have recently decided to try and do everything electronically in my life, so I have my remarks actually here electronic. We'll see how that works out for everyone. But let me just start by talking about what I think is probably going to be discussed some here in some length in this session, which really deals with risks and how we perceive risks with our facilities. All complex systems involve risk. We choose to accept those risks posed by these systems because we perceive that there are benefits of these systems that surpass the risks. However, of course, it is still our responsibility, especially as engineers and scientists, to develop reasonable systems to attempt to mitigate the risks associated with these threats. We traditionally approach this sort of risk reduction by either decreasing the likelihood of an event occurring or by trying to mitigate the consequences should that event occur. And traditionally, in most cases, we try to decrease the likelihood of that event occurring first, and then try to deal with the consequence mitigation second. And of course, as all of us know, nuclear fuel contains a potential energy that surpasses that available from conventional fuel sources. And this particular potential energy generates the consequences that could be very far-reaching. So when we have nuclear accidents, they always end up in the news. They always impact, they cross boundaries, they go outside of our borders, and typically, oftentimes, we will say that a nuclear event at one facility is really a nuclear event at all facilities. And because of this, nuclear energy programs tend to require a degree of responsibility that surpasses what traditionally is required by other energy systems. And so we have to establish systems that reliably mitigate the risks associated with nuclear energy. And I would argue that in many cases, the systems we currently have are really not sufficient for this. And part of this is due to some fundamental flaws in our understanding of risk, which, if you read the literature, of course, there's a lot of discussion about these low probability, high consequence events and how you would try to understand these events, and how a lot of our mathematics associated with them is probably not correct. And typical probabilistic risk analysis, we typically just multiply the likelihood of a consequence, multiply times the consequence itself. And that simple view tends to allow you to play decreasing the likelihood of a consequence, even if the consequence itself is very large. If you can make that likelihood, like core damage frequencies, 10 to the minus eighth and things like that per reactor per year, you can make the consequence, the total risk of that event, essentially negligible. Even though in reality, if the event occurs, it is not at all negligible. It's in fact the largest thing that's ever going to happen to you in your life. And this tends to mean that proportionally, I think we tend to spend too little money on the high consequence events and probably too much money on the very low consequence events, the things that at a facility is what you actually deal with every single day. The small things that occur that in fact are probably not meaningful to the overall viability of the system. And of course, I understand why that occurs. As a manager, it's difficult to try to continue to support a system that is designed to deal with something that is never, ever going to happen. We in the United States deal with this every day whenever we look at our nuclear weapons stockpile. Our nuclear weapons stockpile was designed, built, and maintained with the intention of never, ever using it. And it's very difficult to argue to a member of Congress why you would want them to continue to spend billions of dollars on something that you never, ever intend to use. We've been lucky in the fact that they've actually been willing to continue to do that, and as have some other countries that benefit from our weapon systems. But the reality is, for us to then start talking about how do you get rid of those nuclear weapons and to decrease that, which is of course a discussion outside of this realm here, but is a very interesting discussion then to go through. I also think that there's another fundamental flaw in our understanding of these kinds of events, which is that we assume that the probability of occurrence of these types of events is relatively low. If you just look at the number of core melts that we've had in our industry over the last, let's say, 40 years now, and look at the probability of that occurrence, it's actually, there's something wrong with our math. It's fundamentally flawed. We've melted multiple cores, yet the probability of us melting even a single one thus far should have actually been very, very small. And of course, that's because there are other things that work in our systems beyond just the hardened engineering part of it. And that gets to the real core of this topic today, which is that when we deal with safety design for our facilities, we tend to look at naturally occurring incidences for which we believe we have some understanding of what the frequency of occurrence is, and then also human accidents, non-intentional human events, for which we try to estimate the likelihood of these events, but we actually have no real ability to do that. That is complicated by what we deal with, which is security, which in that case, the frequency of occurrence is driven by an intelligent and adaptable adversary who intentionally creates these events. Which case, in that case, the intelligent adaptable adversary will force this high consequence event to occur. It'll eliminate the likelihood of occurrence from the entire equation, and what you are left with is consequence mitigation and how you will mitigate those consequences of that particular event. And this, of course, creates the crossroads between safety and security, where both systems will actually have some responsibility for mitigating a particular event. And safety systems oftentimes factor into our security systems. Not only do we have a responsibility for keeping that adversary from getting into the facility, but we also have a responsibility with the safety systems to try and mitigate the consequence should it begin. Part of this goes to the fact that in the past, we typically didn't deal as much with security as we did with safety. This is especially true in the United States. In the U.S., we have over many, many years tried to develop a rigorous safety culture. We're still continuing to do that, but I think we've made a lot of good strides towards that. But our understanding of security was never at the level that our safety understanding was, and I'd argue today it probably still isn't. And part of that is because our risks have evolved, the threat has evolved. Prior to 9/11, we didn't really perceive terrorist incidents the way we do today. We didn't understand the breed of extremism that now exists. We typically believed in the old ideals of things like self-protection and rational actors and these sorts of details, which today don't appear to be relevant. The values of our adversaries are not our values. They do not think like we do. They do not act like we do. They're highly organized, they're meticulous, they plan their attacks, they make use of intelligence gathering, they make use of essentially special operations capabilities, they employ insiders at our facilities. If you look at each of the major terrorist incidents that occurred in the last 3 years, all of them actually involve some degree of insider threat. And so we have to continue to ensure that our facilities remain to be unattractive targets to these adversaries, that they will choose not to attack nuclear facilities. Now, I think that there's a number of areas in our particular industry, the nuclear industry, that I think can use improvement, and I'm just going to give a few of them here, and I'll try to do so as briefly as I can. One, I believe the integration of safety and security in both the design, construction, operation, and regulation of nuclear energy systems is a vital need. In some places, I think we do that well. In some places, I think we do not. Too often are those two entities treated as separate and sometimes not equal partners. I believe they're fundamentally aligned, that they have common mission to protect society from threats from the nuclear energy system, whether those are intentionally created threats or whether they are accidentally or randomly created threats. I believe that the enhancement of nuclear safety and security culture at all levels is needed. We need to really, this culture, when it exists, all employees at a facility truly believe that the undesirable event could occur. That means that if you're working at a facility and you say, well, today the adversary is not going to attack me, that means you have bad security culture. You need to actually believe there's a pretty good chance the adversary is trying to attack me right now. And you need to be taking those steps to try and ensure that that doesn't happen. And the same thing's true of safety culture. And therefore, you would never trade off the protection of your system to efficiency and things like that for minor profit gains. Another thing that I believe in firmly, which maybe goes beyond the discussion here, but I think there's a real need for a better understanding of risk analysis. That what we've been doing with our risk analysis in the past, I think has some fundamental flaws to it that at least historically bear out. So I think there's a lot of work to do there that is sort of fundamental, almost academic work in a way. And then something, if you were at the previous session in this room, Professor Ahn had mentioned resilience engineering, which I also put in my comments as well, that our systems have a tendency to be too rigid in their construction, their design, and their operation. I think we need to have fairly flexible nuclear safety and security systems. We need to allow the humans in the system to use their knowledge when appropriate, but then also allow the hardware in the system to do what it does best, and design the system with flexible defenders in place. To acknowledge that there are going to be unforeseen events that are going to occur at our facilities. It's going to happen. And when those unforeseen events occur, how do we mitigate the consequences associated with those? The system that we designed in is likely not going to be able to handle that event. Some human is going to be involved, and that human has to make decisions. And then lastly, better integration of nuclear emergency management or crisis management globally, I think, is needed. The Fukushima event was a case of that, where these events really do broaden beyond just one nation. And all of our nations actually have to work together in this crisis management. We need to bring all of our resources to bear on these particular systems. And in some cases, those agreements that are needed between states simply don't exist right now. And so for each country that has these facilities, they need to think about, if these kinds of things occurred, how would we manage this? Would we have the resources available? Do we have the ability to fly these systems? In many cases, we don't. Who has these abilities? Who do we need to enter into these agreements with? Because if those don't exist at the time that the crisis is occurring, you're not likely to get an agreement in place. I'll sort of sum up my comments there. I think there is a number of places for improvement, and I'm sure my colleagues will probably talk about other things. And all of these would help us to ensure a more peaceful nuclear energy systems globally. So next I'll allow my colleague Dunita to my left to, again, make about 5 to 7 minutes worth of remarks, and then
Sure.
go from there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Charlton. I'm happy to have been invited to speak here. I feel slightly out of place, perhaps, in this group. I'm an international lawyer by education and practice. So if I could just add quickly to my bio and why I'm involved in this particular panel. My area of focus is nuclear security, and actually in that capacity I am advising the chair of the NSS, the Nuclear Security Summit 2014, on aspects of the international legal framework for nuclear security. So I'm involved in that capacity directly with the NSS. But what I'd like to talk about then right now is sort of the international legal aspects of this whole discussion, because I think that has a lot to do with cooperation, for example, and with the way that the international community views the opportunities for working together. I think what was just mentioned about threat perception, risk perception, is really reflected in the development of the international legal regime up until this point. If you look at, for example, nuclear safety in international law, which we're now talking about, the measures specifically aimed at protecting people and the environment from incidents, from authorized incidents or incidents that occur accidentally. You see that after certain large-scale incidents at 3 Mile Island, for example, or Chernobyl especially, that's when the international community has decided to develop the international legal regime. So you see specifically after Chernobyl, a couple of international legal instruments were adopted almost immediately on the area of communicating nuclear accidents, information sharing, and then those sort of aspects. Nuclear security, on the other hand, and that's where it gets into how the international community, from a legal perspective, deals with the threat of nuclear terrorism. So it's the prevention, detection, and response to acts of nuclear terrorism. That developed after 9/11, essentially. Prior to that, there were some provisions in different instruments that dealt with potential acts of nuclear terrorism, but they're very specific. So terrorist bombing convention, use of explosives to spread radiation, for example, was covered in a convention. After 9/11, there was a lot more focus in the international legal sphere for international terrorism, for nuclear terrorism in particular. So you have in 2005, you have the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, which was the first time that nuclear terrorism was established as a crime at the international level. So that convention essentially defines the acts that are considered acts of nuclear terrorism, which includes the possession of radioactive materials or related devices, the use of radioactive materials or sabotage of facilities, and then also threats and those kind of things, but always with the intent to cause harm to people and or the environment. So as I said, at the international legal level, the definitions of safety and security are separate. That's not to say that there isn't some sort of overlap. As I mentioned, well, actually, I'll get into that in a second, because I wanted to mention certain elements of the international legal regime that have specific, that kind of define how international law is developed to suppress acts of nuclear terrorism. There are 3 main elements that I'd like to quickly talk about. One is that states are required to put in place a system of physical protection of materials and facilities. So within international law, there is the idea, essentially, and that's reflected in the international instruments that have been adopted, that while states are responsible for their own nuclear security, there needs to be some level of harmonization when it comes to physical protection measures. So you have the Convention for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, which contains certain basic rules for physical protection, and then based on categories of radioactive materials. There are certain objectives then to the physical protection, and and that has to do with protecting the materials from unauthorized removal. Also, implementation of measures to locate and recover stolen or missing nuclear materials, protecting against the sabotage of nuclear facilities, and then at the end, mitigating and minimizing radiological consequences. So that's contained kind of in the principles of physical protection, and I think the last one, especially mitigating and minimizing, is where there's an overlap at the international law level between safety and security. In 2005, there was a conference to amend the Convention for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material because it was thought of as not comprehensive enough because it dealt only with nuclear material in international transport, and then physical protection in use, storage, or transport, but the use and storage had to do only with use and storage incidental to international transport, so it left a lot of gaps. So there was an effort to amend the convention. The amendment contained then several new aspects, and one of the aspects was protecting against potential acts of sabotage, and then also containing certain fundamental principles of physical protection that states should apply. A second element of the international law framework to deal with acts of nuclear terrorism is that certain acts need to be made crimes within domestic legislation, and jurisdiction has to be extended to those certain acts. What's interesting about this actually is that in the different instruments there are different definitions of what those acts are. So as you can imagine, for example, in the Nuclear Terrorism Convention, the definition of nuclear facility, for example, is different from the definition of nuclear facility in the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. So when you then look at national implementation of these international legal obligations, you can imagine that there are either overlaps or there are missing elements. So if a state is party to one, it misses the elements of the other convention. And the third basic element of the international legal framework to combat nuclear terrorism has to do with cooperation. All of the instruments have elements of cooperation in them. So it can go from notification of threats. So if a state has gleaned that there's a threat to a nuclear facility in another state, the state is obliged to notify the state in which the threatened nuclear facility is, and then provide information on the nature of the threat, for example. There's also coordination requirements when it comes to mitigation. So states are obliged, to the extent possible and in compliance with their own national legislation, to provide assistance or to render assistance to the extent that they can for other states, if so asked, or also if they just offer to do that. There's also a lot of coordination when it comes to the lost material, stolen material, to regain those materials. So those are the three major aspects of the international legal regime. I could go into more detail, but I think that's first of all, there's not enough time, and that perhaps it's quite a warm room, and I don't want to put anybody to sleep. So I suppose just to kind of wrap up, the nature of international law is that states are only required to take the measures that they have consented to, and that becomes a problem because when it's deemed necessary to take certain measures in order to be truly secure, and some states fall outside of the legal framework, then that creates certain gaps in the system. So, for example, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials has 148 states parties, but as I said, is not comprehensive enough. The amendment is not yet enforced because not enough states have ratified the amendment. So those gaps remain. The Nuclear Terrorism Convention has fewer states parties. And this is a common feature of international law is there will remain gaps so long as these instruments are not universal. So I think it's very important, and certainly going forward to the next Nuclear Security Summit, that these instruments are universalized to the greatest possible extent. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Wong?
Yeah, we are talking about the right subject in this part of the world about terrorism, because this part of the world may become very vulnerable to terrorism more and more in the future, as this conflict between nationalism and religions and ideology and culture may collide more often with the globalization process. As we can see what happened in Middle East and what happened in India, Pakistan, and inside China, and also between North and South Koreas. And this terrorism should be carefully examined in different way from terrorism of 9/11, because many countries in this part of the world were occupied by other forces, other countries during the Second World War. And that time, as a part of resistance activities, terrorism to occupied force is viewed as patriotism. And after Second World War, there were many a fight between political parties divided by ideology. One is supported by Western, one is by communism, capitalism, and they were viewed as a justifiable struggle to make right history. So we have to be very creative and very different in viewing terrorism in this part of the world. And 9/11, in contrast, is a clear act of a non-state actor. And the US NRC has identified some protocols to fight against design-based threat, and beyond design-based threat by detecting and delaying and replying this. But it wouldn't work in this part because high population density, there are people mixed up. How will you detect anybody having any preparing to have a suicidal bombing there? No way. It's so close. The distance between target and the living area is so close. So we have to be a little bit creative. IAEA with the InfoCirc 225, Revision 5 is emphasizing human resource development and the licensing national control. But this does not address a peculiarity of issues with terrorism in this part of the world. So this community should pay far more attention to become realistic, to solve a problem of region where terrorism is going to be utmost political issue in the world during this century. So what should do? Well, people here have been very much desensitized by bombing or shooting or killing because we've been living this way. North Korea has been shooting us 1,000 times since we had a ceasefire in 1953. And then, well, there was nuclear bomb testing. Our stock price went up. How can you explain? We are fully desensitized by terrorism. So with this kind of culture, how can you expect politicians and government make an effort to establish something equivalent to Homeland Security in the United States? No way. Unless experts in this community come to a mechanism to convince policymakers and lawmakers and insurance publishers all those people to make tangible action items. Otherwise, it's hopeless. And nevertheless, we should address the safety of operating power plant, including nuclear power plant, and also research reactors, spent nuclear fuel storage areas. What do we do? Well, we'll do all those addressed by US and IAEA, but we also pay attention to Nuclear Security Summit. We had one last year in Seoul, and there was communique about nuclear security and also gift basket to prepare for special action on illicit trade and smuggling of nuclear material, radiological materials security and transportation security, and security training centers and national registration. But one more, very important, very, very, very important one is cybersecurity. And this country is heavily digitalized, and without paying much attention to digital terrorism. And then now we know Stuxnet is becoming widespread, and all the softwares are not able to handle that issue. But there is a growing sentiment about nuclear safety after Fukushima accident, and public demands, politically demands, to open up more information from nuclear power operations. They even demand they have online access to the operation informations, which is very, very dangerous. But government has no ideas what to do. And this community should pinpoint how dangerous such attempt could be. And otherwise, we may be vulnerable to terrible cyber terrorism. And we also should look for a future. And we have variety of technical and institutional mechanism to build a new nuclear power plant, to develop new systems which can be far more immune to this mode and this culture. And for example, we can develop a sheltered interim storage for spent nuclear fuels. And unlike above ground storage, which is very popular in the United States, that may be too dangerous here. And something like German design with some mount on the top with the spent fuels in the tunnels. And we have a lot of mountains. Fortunately, we can build the tunnels, just like highway tunnels, and to secure spent nuclear fuel for long-term storages. That is something we should seriously consider. And furthermore, we should build underground control tower for nuclear power plant at every single nuclear power plant. And we should be prepared for attack from the nuclear north side by using conventional terrorisms. Now, I mentioned terrorism by North Korea, just state actors. We accept that as a terrorism because we do not want to say that that is action by North Korea. We are too scared. So also small modular reactor technology, which is a wonderful option that can be placed underground with completely rugged structure, with control independent, without having dependence on external power supply, having own passive cooling system with own emergency power systems. And also, we can have some sort of fortified operational scheme, and which will make early defense around the nuclear power plant site. And also, in order to make all these essential elements materialize, we should have good safety security governance in the country. And we should have not only legislation, also we should have good international consensus about this culture. International study and documentation and tangible action items that is well spelled out for immediate implementation here in Korea for mothers. I think education and outreach and peaceful nuclear power sustainability promotion, that's all important. But for example, in this part, we have a proliferation concern. If we have a spent nuclear fuel recycle issues, well, atomic agreement 123 with the United States is exactly tackling on that issue. But we not only worry about proliferation, we also worry about security. When we have a pyroprocess plant operating, somebody, a raid bomb, then it's worse than Fukushima action, maybe 10 times worse. How can he take it? It's totally, radiologically unacceptable consequence. How do we do that? Maybe we can have multinational control and multinational sanctuary for spent nuclear fuel recycling system. I think that can address both proliferation issue and security issue as well. Even though we do a physical, digital security measures, but we need institutional protections as well. So with that, I'd like to really ask this expert community not only address those Western issues, also pay more attention to these Eastern issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So I would like to start with the explanation of the international status of the nuclear security. The IAEA's illicit trafficking database, the last year reported more than nearly the 200 cases have already reported to the IAEA, including the high enriched uranium transaction. And still, such kind of illicit trafficking is there. And the next is the intrusion to the nuclear power plant. Last year in France, and Greenpeace activists fly into the Vagi nuclear power plant by paraglider. That is the very new intrusion method. This was occurring last May, so May 2nd, 2012. And the other example of the vulnerability of the security that was occurring in Sweden. Explosive found at the Ringhals nuclear power plant. A small amount of explosive without triggering devices was found on the forklift truck on its way into the premises of the nuclear power plant. It was discovered by the bomb-sniffing dog. And the other Sweden's example is the Greenpeace as well. Activists broke into the Ringhals nuclear power plant and Forsmark nuclear power plant last October. That is a very new case in 2012. And the Greenpeace activists climb over cut fence to enter into the nuclear power plants, and the police arrested 67 people in total. After the arrest, some activists remain in the restricted area in Ringhals. That is also the very bad example. And the last one in the United States, last July, that was occurred in the Y-12, very heavily guarded facility, Y-12, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. 3 anti-war activists, including 82-year-old, none passed into protected area by cutting fence and reportedly dumped blood, put up placard and added paint word to the side of structure. And these are last year's cases. So still those kind of nuclear threat was there. And fortunately, the intention of the Greenpeace activists is not to sabotage the nuclear power plant, just to demonstrate the vulnerability of the nuclear power plant physical protection system. But still, that's the threat of the nuclear security. So we don't easily understand that still the nuclear terrorism attack, nuclear sabotage, possibility of the nuclear sabotage or nuclear attack to the nuclear power plant is a very not likely, but the threat is there. That is the very important thing. So we have to understand the importance of that, the understanding of that status. The impact of the nuclear terrorism, you have already known about we have a direct harm or loss, a loss of property caused by the explosion. And once the nuclear device is explosion, the lots of contamination was occurred, so we need to large space decontamination, and the social and economic damages was also occurred. So the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident illustrates the potential nuclear sabotage consequences. So the next, I would like to touch on the lessons learned from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant on nuclear security as well as nuclear safety. As for the nuclear security, the Fukushima accident demonstrated possible effectiveness of a terrorist attack to some critical functions. For example, the battery of the nuclear power plant, and the reactor cooling circuit, reactor cooling system, and spent fuel cooling system. And the alternate type of malicious act, for example, the attack on the component located around the protected area, for example, the seawater pump, that was the final heat sink of the nuclear power plant. And the Fukushima accident pointed out the necessity of the preparation for the contingency, and that was combined with the safety preparedness. And the lesson learned on the safety from the Fukushima, that has a lot of lessons from the safety perspective. For example, the prevention of severe accident, earthquake and tsunami and power supply and cooling function of reactor, and the primary containment vessel, spent fuel pool, the accident management, and the water tightness of essential equipment. And the next category is the countermeasures against the severe accident. So hydrogen explosion, containment vent, radiation exposure management, training for the severe accident management, and the instrumentation for reactors and the primary containment vessels and rescue team. The next category is the response to nuclear emergency, natural disaster and nuclear accident, and environmental monitoring, roles between the central and local government and local organization, communication for the local residents and citizens, as well as international community, and the wide area of the evacuation and radiological protection standards. That was the lesson learned from the response to nuclear emergency. And the next category is the enhancement of the safety infrastructure. The most biggest one is the independent regulatory authority and the promotion sector. So the Japanese government have already established a new regulation authority divided from the promotion sector. The last one is the instill, the cultivate the safety culture. So maybe the lesson learned on safety, we categorize the 5 categories. But these lessons learned from the Fukushima on nuclear safety is very related to the nuclear security as well. So I would like to touch on the interface between nuclear security and nuclear safety. So there are commons and contradiction between the nuclear security and nuclear safety. For example, as for the commons, the prevention of accident, prevention of sabotage, these countermeasure is almost the same. So we have to think about at once in the prevention of the accident and sabotage, and countermeasures for accident and sabotage as well. We have to think about at once both. And also emergency preparedness, that is very important to synergy of between the nuclear safety and the nuclear security. The last one is fostering safety and security culture. What is the contradiction between the security and the safety? As for the security, we need to keep the confidentiality of the information about the physical protection system. So we have to control the information. On the other hand, as for the safety, we have to keep the openness and transparency and the information provision to the public. That is the very different part of the between the security and the safety. And the other one is the security is designed by the design-based threat. But as for the nuclear safety, we design based on the design-based accident. That is the contradictions between the security and the safety. But the total target is the same for the security and the safety, the same goal. The both safety and security has a goal for the protection of the public and environment. So maybe we can easily understand the importance of the synergy of obtaining the synergy between the nuclear safety and the nuclear security. But how to get the synergy, that is very important. And recently we have a lots of discussion, the synergy between the nuclear safety and the nuclear security, but just scratching the surface of the both. So we need to more deeply think about the synergy. And I have a full proposal for how to obtain the synergy from the nuclear safety and nuclear security. First one is the design, security and safety by design at once. That is connected, related to the Professor Fan's proposal. So he proposed to design a new design, the very immune new system. So that is considered in a safety perspective as well as the nuclear security perspective. So it is necessary in the design basis to consider in the design basis. That is the first one. And the second one is the research and development of the synergized regulation system. The safety regulation system have already established very nicely. But as for the nuclear security, that is not so much, so good. So the research and development of synergized regulation system is very, very important. And the third one is cultivate safety and security culture. And last one is, this is also very important as well, the sustained good communication among stakeholders related to the nuclear safety and nuclear security, as well as the other stakeholders. That is very, very important. And safety design and regulation system have already well established, so the security part could learn a lot from those experience. Thank you. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by just asking a couple of questions of our panel here, and then I'm going to try to leave time for us to open it up to the audience as well. I'm actually going to start with a question I wasn't really originally intending to ask, but we, as a set of panelists, didn't really talk too much about the particular types of nuclear security events that we have to protect against. We only sort of briefly mentioned it. But one question that I get from students a lot, I teach this stuff in class, so I get a lot of weird questions, but one question I get from students a lot is, why do you believe that terrorists have not attacked our facilities? We've had large-scale safety incidents, but we've really not had large-scale security incidents at our facilities. The ones you mentioned were mainly by protesters, not people who had an intention of actually causing an off-site radiological release. So why do you believe that that disconnect exists?
But I think yes, I did not touch on the case, but still in the Central Africa, the uranium facility was attacked, actually. And the other case is the South Africa in 2006 or 2008. They were attacked by the terrorists, the guarded terrorists, to get in the Pelindaba Nuclear Research Institute. So we have a case to actual sabotage to the nuclear facility as well. That is not much case, but we have a couple of cases to actual attack to the nuclear facility.
Do you believe that the perception is that our facilities are difficult to attack and therefore they won't attack them? A lot of people believe that terrorists tend to go after soft targets. They wouldn't go after a hard target like that.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hall? Professor
Yeah,
Hall?
that's very good question. And in Korea, and we always emphasize the security and also high quality standard of nuclear power plant construction. So concrete in nuclear power plant is totally different from other sectors. It's much more sturdy, and many thought a nuclear power plant is something invincible up to Fukushima accident. Now, Fukushima really unraveled how vulnerable we are. And now, I think North Korea may think a different way. So that's why I think this nuclear security summit that addressed security safety interface last year is very, very appropriate.
Since you had mentioned the Nuclear Security Summit, another question I had meant to ask was, I believe the Nuclear Security Summit has raised visibility of nuclear security as being a major issue. Do any of you have examples that you can point out of specific concrete things that have actually taken place as part of that? Anyone? We ask this question a lot, by the way, too.
Well, I don't know if but well, I mean, there are certain in the leading up to 2012 in Seoul, there were national reports prepared by each of the states that attended and participated in the Nuclear Security Summit process, and I think, I mean, there have been some concrete steps made. I think it has to do a lot with you know, giving up highly enriched uranium, for example, and switching to low enriched uranium. Some repatriation, I think, in the kind of in the former Soviet Union
I
area.
believe all those processes started before the Nuclear Security Summits.
Right. But I think that the Nuclear Security Summit served to give more impetus to following through on some of those perhaps promises that were made beforehand, because it served to highlight kind of what was either going on already or to kind of foment more activity in that area, I believe.
I can actually point out one area that, as an academic, I've noticed, which is prior to the Nuclear Security Summits, because it wasn't highlighted as something that students traditionally considered, after that I've seen a lot more nuclear security being incorporated into courses at universities. Now, whether or not you can create a direct cause and effect from the security summits, I don't know about that, but there clearly is more nuclear security-related course material at universities, at least within the United States, and I think within other countries, than there was prior to that point in time. And actually, it's actually in one of the working papers from the Washington Nuclear Security Summit, was the fact that this needed to move into an educational framework and those sorts of details. And there was a few people who pointed out that actually could be the most significant impact actually from the entire process, would be to engage it within the educational process, which would then make it so that all engineers and scientists would understand that they have a security responsibility as well as a safety responsibility as well as a non-proliferation responsibility, which would then hopefully move towards that overall cultural development. So we only have about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to at least have some opportunity to get questions from the audience. So at this point, what I'd like to do is just open it up to questions from the audience, and we'll take those questions as best we can. I believe there's a microphone wandering around out there somewhere, I'm hoping. Oh, there you go.
Hello, my name Ai from Indonesia. As you might know, Indonesia have a problem with a lot of terrorism problem. This problem kind of delay our nuclear program because people turn scared about nuclear terrorism, attack to the nuclear power plant if we have one later on. You might know that in a year there's a bomb here and there in my country, easily in hotel, in a lot of public area. So how if that's happened in our nuclear power plant, like in the backyard, suddenly bomb is coming to there, and it can cause a lot of effect to public, of course. So addressing the synergy between security and safety, I want to ask if there is very big kind of high security problem raised up like right now, what regulation we should approach, because actually I work for the regulatory, and there's a really different, as the speaker said, approaching between security and safety. So which we should, first thing, we should put it, how many percentage we should put it? Should we become so open and consider more safety, or should we consider more security in terms of our country terrorism problem, something like that? So would you mind to give some suggestion, if the country have a higher probability of terrorism, what should we do with the regulation synergy? How many percentage we should consider security? How many percentage we should consider safety? Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if there actually is an answer to that question, but what you're basically asking about is that as a country, you have to balance these two issues of safety and security. And safety incidents are ones that are going to occur. Natural disasters, things like that. You have no control over whether or not those events occur. Pump failures, those sorts of things. The security events, you may have some ability to try and influence the adversary's decision to choose to attack you. But even that, you may not have that much control over. How you balance those two things, I don't think there's any one answer, but the reality is you have to protect against both of them. You cannot just trade one off against the other, which is why some of what was pointed out earlier is that in reality what you should look for is synergies between the two, safety and security. That both your regulatory structure needs to have those synergies. Your regulatory structure likely does not treat safety and security from the same sort of rigorous perspective. Most do not. In most cases, you might already have some sort of a risk-based analysis that's being done for your safety case. You probably don't have that for security case. And even if you do, you may not treat it in the same way. So I think what I would argue, and you can hear what the other panelists say, but in my case I would argue that you should probably try to aim for the areas in which there is an overlap between safety and security and try to enhance those. But you can't just trade one off against the other. You have to protect against both threats.
If I just wanted to point out quickly too that part of it has to do with national implementation of the international obligations. And I say this specifically because in the context of the Nuclear Security Summit, Indonesia proposed a national legislation implementation kit because it is important in there are these general obligations at the international level, but of course it's important how they're implemented at the national level, and this gets to the balance then in your national regulatory infrastructure. But it has a lot to do with also capacity, I think national capacity, how you determine whether there is a capacity to devote a huge amount of resources to security and to safety separately, or whether you need to really make an effort to find the synergies. I think that's sort of a state-by-state process.
Did you also want
Yes, maybe Professor Fan suggested the one option is to construct the more robust, more immune new nuclear power plant system. If a new country plan to introduce the nuclear power plant in 10 years or in 15 years, maybe it is possible to develop such kind of more immune nuclear power plant system, considering the both nuclear safety as well as the nuclear security.
Maybe more modular.
Yes, so that is one answer. And recently, the nuclear security the threat of the nuclear security is evolving the year to year. So the more strengthening. So infant 2 to 5, level 5 is very, very strong for the nuclear power plant owners. So the nuclear power plant operator have to strengthening the physical protection system. That is the most costly. So that's why it is very beneficial in the design in the both safety and security to reduce the cost and the robust system.
Since I'm the moderator and have the ability, I'm going to go ahead and comment on that too. It's great to be the boss. That's actually, I think, a key point that in our industry we tend to not pay much attention to. But once I design and build a facility, my job is not done. I have a responsibility to maintain that facility. And as we were saying, that as the threat evolves from a security standpoint, I have to upgrade my physical security systems to manage that threat. I actually have the exact same issue with security, with safety. Even though the likelihood of an earthquake maybe isn't changing, as I understand more about my facility, I then say, well, I need to now modify the facility to deal with this. This event that I didn't perceive was going to occur prior to that, but now I think might. And so as operators and owners of these facilities, we have a responsibility to continually reevaluate what our threats are and to redesign, re-implement systems in order to be able to achieve that. And sometimes facilities don't do that, and that puts us then at risk. So I'm sorry.
Scott Sagan from Stanford University. I'd like to especially to hear from the non-Americans on the panel, although Bill, you can chime in as well. How you deal with the following problem. Many of us in the nuclear security area have had many meetings where both publicly and more often privately, non-Americans will say the terrorist threat against nuclear facilities is a U.S. obsession, and that while the risk is not zero, you are exaggerating it in the United States. Then secondly, they'll say, well, even if you're not exaggerating it, it's your problem because it's your foreign policy that's causing this, and that if a terrorist attack occurs, it'll come against you.
You got friends.
Both of those problems, I think, are wrong, and I don't think you share those perceptions. But how often do you hear it still, and how do you combat that problem?
Maybe I have already mentioned in my presentation the Fukushima accident have already demonstrated the possible effectiveness for the terrorist attack to the nuclear power plant. That is the explanation to that kind of. Okay.
Now, before Fukushima accident, everybody would think it takes Boeing 767 to attack nuclear power plants. No, it's much easier. So that's why we need some action. That's why this will happen this part of the world, maybe everywhere.
I've heard the comment you're saying as well, Scott, but I've also heard, it depends on who you talk to. In some instances, I've talked to people from other countries, and they have said they do realize that terrorism is a real threat to them, just like our colleague from Indonesia had pointed out. And I think part of it probably has to do with whether or not you have personally observed it within your country, and if you haven't, you may not be aware of it. But I think it's a good question. Again, not one I have an answer for, but good question. Sorry, there was one in the back over there.
Thank you. Hannah from Iowa Women's University. So you were talking about how there are fundamental flaws in our security and safety systems, and you recommended that there needs to be an improvement in the cultures of both of them. Now, I think that that's a long-term process, but you can talk about changing a culture, but is that really as easy as it sounds? I want to know what sort of practical options you have considered in how to change the culture. One that you mentioned is that we need to bring all nations' resources together to deal with crises like Fukushima. In my opinion, I feel like the international legal framework is a possibility of bringing that sort of international cooperation together. But if states are only obliged to adhere to the legal framework to the extent that they think is necessary, does that render the international legal framework impotent as a movement of cooperation? Thank you.
I'm going to break that into two questions. I'll field the first half, and then I'll lob the second half. The first half is your question about developing and maintaining safety and security culture. And if I gave you the impression that was an easy thing to do, I failed miserably. That is not an easy thing to do. It also is a never-ending job. It doesn't ever stop. You have to constantly continue to evolve and develop that. That process involves a number of different things. And there's actually been a lot of study recently on security culture. Safety culture actually goes back a bit longer. But security culture, more recently, there's been a fair amount of study in that. That began with an IEA document that you can download off the web. I think it's NSS 7. Don't quote me on the number. But, and then following that, WINS actually put out a best practice guide on this several years ago. I don't remember when. But if you read through that, it'll actually talk about concrete steps that one can take. But begin with the concept that training and education is fundamental to culture. That espoused values through your management. Management must consider these things to be important. If not, the people who work at a facility are probably not going to consider it to be important. Is it something that you talk to your facility workers about? Is it something that you, through your performance evaluation process, that you actually consider to be important enough that you actually give people raises based on them having these values, based on their actions? If it is not, then it's not being shown as being something important now, is it? If you don't give them, if their pay doesn't reflect it. So there's actually a number of concrete steps, but I don't want to point out that you just do some of these over 1 month and now I can quit for the rest of the year and I don't have to worry about it. These are things that we have to continually do and maintain and continually evolve. So there really is no one answer to that particular question, but there is a lot of things that can be done. And near and dear to my heart, I do believe that education is a really important part of that. That when most of us came through as nuclear engineers or physicists or chemists, we probably learned a lot about safety. At least I did. I came through post 3 Mile Island, so safety was something that was core to our nuclear engineering education. Security was not something that was core to our nuclear engineering education. It was actually never mentioned, never, when I was an undergraduate. I never ever heard it at all. Today, it's moving towards something that we're saying, this is one of the legs of this stool that allows nuclear energy to exist. Safety, security, and safeguards exist together, and without any one of them, the system will completely fail. And so I believe that education is important, and then continued training as you maintain yourself as a professional. The international law question you asked is what question I was actually similar to that one I was going to ask, which is that international law right now, the way you had worded it was in terms of the crisis management question, that if you're dealing with a crisis or the emergency management of following a crisis, that most countries don't have the resources to actually fully handle that on their own. Should this be something that's more ingrained within the overall international law framework? Today, correct me if I'm wrong, but the nuclear security is by international law considered to be the responsibility of the state. And if the state has responsibility for dealing with that, then that by default says that the international community does not have responsibility for it. Do you believe that there's something fundamentally flawed to that? Is there some changes that we need to address her concerns?
Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think whether it's flawed or not, I mean, from an international law perspective, the nature of kind of multilateral legal frameworks, when you're dealing with 100 for the CPPNM, when you're dealing with 148 states, the extent to which they agree to enter into legally binding obligations tends to get lower and lower. That's not to say that it doesn't form a basis for international cooperation. I mean, I think concluding international legal agreements is very much evidence of cooperation at the international level. There are flaws, of course, but I wouldn't necessarily use the word impotence when describing the legal framework. But I think within the framework, there's a lot of cooperation. For example, in the European Union, does a lot of work helping states build infrastructure, implement legislation, educates engineers, for example. I mean, there's a lot of cooperation on sort of those levels, sort of interstate levels, and not necessarily at the global legal framework level. So I think it's an evidence of cooperation, and it provides a basis for further cooperation.
Okay.
The answer to that question, I would say, is an experience. A Russian writer, Pushkin, once told us experience is the source of great state of the human today. Now, why United States is well prepared with the Homeland Security Department after Fukushima for nuclear security? Because they had experience with the nuclear bomb. They had terrible mistakes with nuclear weapons. And they know how vulnerable nuclear weapons are and how vulnerable it can be. And U.S. had good safety regulation system because there were terrible safety failures with the weapon recycling system and critical experimental systems right after Second World War. So it's experience that sensitized whole society, community to pay attention to. Then do we have to repeat this bloody experience? We shouldn't. Then what do we do? And this community should compile the experience and should make a movie so that politicians and public general can understand how real this one is and make a system dynamic simulation what will happen to nuclear power plant when we do this one and that one. I think we should build on digital experience to avoid blood experience.
Okay, with that, I think I'm afraid I'm going to have to end. We're at the end of our time, and they're holding up cards back there to tell me to stop. So I just wanted to thank all of our speakers for their comments and thank the audience for all of your questions, which largely came from that area. I'm not sure what that meant. But thank you very much, and with that, I think I'll end this session, and there is a break following this, which I'm sure someone will tell you about. Thank you.